Yeah.
Red lights on.
Red light's on, okay. So introduce Wood
Take
Bouldin.
4.
Well, let me get my stuff out of the way here. Kathy sent me the quotations that she's read today. And it seems to me that that was a really good place to start. And they pretty strongly suggest that the heart of Friends' religion is a personal and a communal experience of existential challenge. I don't usually use that kind of language, but it seemed right today. An existential challenge presented by discovering in conscience a demand for truthfulness that one is able to affirm or run away from. Typically, of course, too much truth of conscience is something we want to get away from. But for Friends, this presence traditionally is called, well, most references to this presence would be, it's the Holy Spirit of Christ, or the Holy Spirit, or just God's presence. And most traditional understandings of it have come from the prologue to the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In Him was the life, and the life was the light of men. Now, I suppose everybody knows about Quakers and what's nowadays called the inner light. Many early Quakers very seldom used the light reference. I think that our primary theologian, Robert Barclay, probably talked about the life more often than the light. But the basic theological argument is that after the fall, and people are running around with no ability to manage themselves, God gifted the human race with a principle of divine presence. All the old theologians of this, the older thinkers of it, use the story about the sower of the seed, and some of the seed falls on rocky ground, and some on shallow ground, and some on good ground, and some of it lands in the road and gets run over, and so on. But everyone who's ever been, every human being who's ever been since Adam and Eve, I guess Adam and Eve got it too when they got those little leather trousers and stuff. Every human being who's ever been has had what is traditionally called a day of visitation, which is a quote from 1 Peter, in which a seed of divinity, a principle of the divine, is put in. Now, this is not something that's natural to people. It's not part of the natural conscience or the natural reason of conscience. It's an inbreaking of the divine. And if you attend to that light, you grow. You grow into an ever greater experience of the eternal life, of the divine itself, and can become perfect. Now, perfect doesn't mean, goody two shoes kind of thing. It's not that you obey every rule and and never jaywalk. The word perfect really means mature. That which has become complete. And to become a complete person is to live as your own self, fully inhabited and guided by that Spirit that was in Christ. Now, of course, this is a point that gets understood in all sorts of different ways nowadays, but that was the traditional understanding of it. And all of the early theology understands this experience as first coming into judgment. The more you start, if you seriously pay attention to conscience, you more and more become aware of your failings. I average 20 failings, new failings a day this way. But the more you attend, the more seriously you subject your self-love and your self-will to this inward teacher, the more you get hints of the true light, and the more that ocean of darkness and sin and death is overcome for you in your experience by the ocean of God's love, the ocean of light and true love. Now, this basic conception has found a place in various kinds of Christian mysticism and mysticisms all over the world. Fox himself, who is the person most primarily in the Quaker tradition, George Fox is the one who pushed this idea the most and brought it to be the center around which Quakerism and its beliefs and practices and all were formed. And what I really want to try to do today is, yes, ma'am.
Just a real quick question: is this concept kind of similar to the Tao?
I think so.
Okay,
I
right
think,
living and the right path, right living, that kind of thought.
Right. Now, the difference, of course, is that within Christian theology and in the tradition, they didn't have another way to think. Mm-hmm. Fox knew there was a China. I doubt if he'd ever heard of Taoism, and he'd not seen any of the Star Wars movies. Well, Yoda might make a pretty good Quaker. Now, the difference is that it's a genuinely theistic foundation. I guess I don't usually go into this one, but you just made it. Just wants to jump right in here. What is the gospel, the introduction to the Gospel of John talking about? In the beginning was the Word, the plan. Logos doesn't actually mean word at all. It means rationale or story or discourse. That's probably would be the best translation. In the beginning was the discourse. But in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was the life, and the life was the light of men. Without him nothing was made that was made. So if you think for a minute and go back to the very beginning of the Bible, there was a swirling chaos, and God's Spirit hovered like a mother buzzard. That's what that word means. The only other use of the word where the Spirit hovers over the waters refers to a buzzard or eagle or something hovering over its nest in the Bible. So the Spirit of God hovered over it, and God said, and that was Christ. That was the Word. That was the Logos. God said, let there be light. So what the metaphysical, what Quakers call the eternal Christ as opposed to the incarnate Christ. What the eternal Christ would be God's activity in the world. And that comes very close to being the Tao. Mm-hmm. And there are Taoists who put a Confucian background behind their Taoism, and then they've got sort of a God, but usually there's nothing behind the Tao. It's like in Zen, there's nothing behind it. All right, Now, in order to construct a Quakerism, and we'll try to do this pretty quickly so we can get up to today with it, but you have to understand that you have this idea we've described, this absolute dependence on inwardness that's not subjective. Now, a lot of people say, oh, it's as subjective as it can be. But at least for the people experiencing it and pursuing it, it's not subjective. It's an inwardness that breaks in from absolute truth and gradually takes you over and shows you what you want to be. But, I mean, it's not a straitjacket, it's a liberation. That's one of the things that would make Taoism a good way into it. Now, this happened in very specific historical circumstances to very specific people. Every tradition of thinking and knowing and feeling has a specific history. There's no such thing as, there's no such thing as abstract truth. Every truth takes place in a tradition and it gets expressed in a tradition. Now, this is important in dealing with Quakerism because one of the fundamental truths for Quakers is that God put the seed of the kingdom in every human being all over the world ever since the fall, which means all you have was Adam and Eve and the people over in the land of Nod. There have been, if this is true, there have always been people who could be identified as friends all over the world in every possible cultural tradition at every time. Most of them, of course, would never have heard of Christianity, Quakerism, George Fox. They couldn't conceive it that way. Most more or less conventional friends would argue that all of those people have in fact met Christ, the eternal Christ, however they conceive it. But that form of universalism, that way of understanding, the tendency of people to come up with Zen Buddhisms and Taoisms and I just lost the word, just as I was going to. That's one of those things that happens, isn't it? What do you call?
The older we get, the more we lose.
Right. What do you call the Quaker group in Islam? The Sufis. Now, not all Sufis, but there's a strong strain in Sufism that comes very close to a lot of Quakerism. It's sort of Zen Quakerism. But so all over the world, this sort of thing has been going on. Now, the specifics of the tradition come out of the Protestant Reformation, from 1517 on, the specifics of the Protestant Reformation in England, which was almost totally a political thing. It got started on how is Henry VIII going to get a divorce so he can marry Anne Boleyn. And then the English Civil War. And a big part of the English Civil War was the fact that the political reformation in England didn't suit a whole lot of people. And so we had the folks that were called Puritans. Now, the American image of Puritans is totally divorced from reality. Did you know that the Pilgrims liked to wear, the guys who came over and settled at Plymouth Rock, they were on their way to Virginia but stopped to brew beer and just didn't leave. They like to wear red shirts. Yeah. Cotton Mather, who's a Puritan, an American Puritan a lot of people know about, has a very interesting and sensually open views on human sexuality in marriage, of course. The Puritans were called Puritans because they wanted to purify the church. They wanted to get rid of hymn singing and all sorts of, stained glass windows, fancy robes for priests. Many of them wanted to further radicalize the theology, make it more Calvinistic. That's just part of what was going on. There was all sorts of social change, political change. The scientific developments of the time had not yet, but were on the verge of changing the way people understood reasoning. Elizabeth died. The Stuart monarchy from Scotland came in, and all four of the Stuart kings, there were two of them in a civil war and then two more, all four of the Stuart kings were political idiots. James the First was interesting. Charles the Second was a good art collector, and that's really about all you can say about him. And they inherited, like our next president is going to do, they inherited a bunch of international problems, an empty treasury, and a huge population of wealthy people who didn't want to pay taxes. So, what eventuated was a profound crisis that came to a head when the King of England, Charles I, needed a bunch of money to hold off a Scottish army that was coming in. And that was 1640. By 1642, things had collapsed. The king rebelled against his parliament. Now, the parliament was rebelling against him too. But technically, Charles I went off to Nottingham and raised his standard. And that's a symbol of a noble, going back to like Magna Carta and so on, a symbol of a noble rebellion. I've had it, all I'm going to take. And so he was calling his family and supporters to him. Come to, gather around the standard. They fought from 42 to 47. The king was captured. He refused absolutely to become part of a constitutional monarchy. Now that would have ended the war because there were a bunch of conservative Puritans that just wanted, a slightly more Calvinistic church and more room for rich guys to play politics. The gentry class in the countryside and the nobles and the new merchants. Well, he wouldn't have anything to do with it. He escaped, started the war over again. They caught him and chopped his head off. And then Oliver Cromwell went out and won 2 more battles, which took the Scots out of the thing, and the war was over for 10 years. Well, the war was over. They couldn't figure out how to set up a government, because once they quit fighting, then they all fought among themselves. And Oliver Cromwell, in effect, became the dictator. They had the Commonwealth until 1658. Cromwell died. His son took over for a year and couldn't solve any of the problems. So a cabal of conservative generals and really conservative politicians called the king back. And we get the restoration under Charles II. Now, this is a framework in which Quakerism came about. You have to imagine now a hierarchical, deeply, profoundly hierarchical society, not totally unlike the one you've all met in Jane Austen novels, but with very limited capacity for social control outside of morals and traditional practices. All of a sudden, there's no effective government in much of the country, and what government there is has got divided loyalties. Some people everywhere are for the king, some people are for the parliament. There's all sorts of social chaos. people who are used to being, listening to such and such a local landlord and know who can tell them what to do. That person's off fighting, or maybe killed, or maybe had his head chopped off. So that, the nearest analogy I've ever been able to find is the United States in the 60s, but it was way beyond that. And every possible idea that had been perking around underneath, very quietly, that all burst out. You had the Anglican Church, you had Anglicans, and you had independents who wanted, they weren't quite Congregationalists, they still wanted a national church, but they wanted each parish to have pretty much charge of itself. Then there were the separatists, like the people who formed the Pilgrims, who wanted every congregation to be completely separate, no government control or anything. Then you had the Muggletonians and the Fifth Monarchy men, and eventually Quakers. But there was enormous anxiety. You go from a society, that's really designed to keep everybody in a traditional comfort zone. That's really what's trying to go on. And it's all flown to flinders. There's wars, of course, back in those days, wars were a much more low-key thing than they are now. So there was a battle here, a battle there. Next week, that first battle was refought. An army of one sort or another marched through and took everybody's crops, and so on. And there was all sorts of people now. There was no control over vagabonds, say. So there were people wandering around everywhere. One of the people that began to wander around was George Fox. And he was born in a small village town in central England. His parents were strict Calvinists, strict Puritans. His father was known as the Righteous Christer. And Fox, describes himself as having been absolutely serious about everything as a child. Everybody said, well, if young George says it's so, then it's so. And he also shared a lot of Puritan things he really didn't like. He was disgusted by wanton behavior, particularly among older people. Drinking healths, carousing, playing sports, watching television, all that sort of stuff. Just galled his soul. But he was internally, in himself, he was desperate. He'd heard all this Puritan stuff about, how you're not supposed to be sinful. You are. And Calvin says we're all sinful, and some of us will be saved regardless. And George, throughout his life, he felt like he didn't do bad things, but he knew he was tempted. And how could temptation be? And he wandered around and talked to everybody, and he talked to all these radical people and picked up ideas, and wandered to the army camps, which were full of, the whole ideology was religious. And one day, he describes himself sitting in a hollow tree reading his Bible, trying to find answers. And one day he's walking down the road, and he was mulling over the fact that he'd come to agree with some of these radicals that there was no reason on earth to have priests, and that to be a minister didn't require education, it just required being called by God to be a minister. And he was thinking about the story, about the doctrine of the atonement and how Christ had saved us. And he got to thinking about, Jesus is tempted by the devil, just like me. And all of a sudden he heard a voice. I don't know whether that's an expression or not, but he heard a voice that said, "There is one, even Christ Jesus, who can speak to your condition." And he said, speak to your condition. Now, if somebody speaks to you, you have to listen. to the conclusion that Christ has come again to teach his people himself. Now here we are in the midst of this, situation which looks like the entire world is just coming to an end. I mean, the culmination of history is upon us. And is the devil going to win, or is God going to win? So Fox began to get his act together. He's about 20 years old at this point. He's born in 24. We're down around, the Civil War started in 42. He would have been 18. I guess he was in his early mid-20s at this point. He meets a woman named Elizabeth Houghton, who was busy beating a bunch of shattered Baptists into shape, giving them a sense of religious direction. And they had already begun to call themselves Friends. Now, I think it's wonderful. We talk about this movement, pulling together all sorts of bits and pieces from the times, and even the name of the group. Now, that name, of course, comes from the 15th chapter of John. Jesus says to his disciples, "I call you not slaves, but friends, because you obey me out of understanding, unlike a slave who just does what he's told." It's not obedience in itself that matters. It's love. Now, this little group of friends begins to preach. Fox was a great preacher. I mean, there's stories about him preaching for 3 hours, standing on a rock somewhere. And spreading the doctrine of the inner light, and trying to build gradually a structure in which people following the inner light could live. You can't have a state church. You can't have an authoritative church. There's no such thing as divine authority invested in any institution. Divine authority is in the Lord Jesus Christ and exercised over people through his inward presence and conscience. So you have to have an organization, and under the circumstances, I mean, the Quakers became increasingly subject to persecution. You have to have an organization that can help people, become, well, like your membership class, become aware of, what follows from the inner light, and also to provide a community, with support and all. So they come up with the idea that now you can't have a formal church as the center of worship, because anybody can worship anywhere if they sit down quietly and wait for God to speak to them. But you can't worship something that's not there. So that worship has to be the Spirit worshiping the Spirit. That's why it has to take place, in silence inside. So they come up with the idea of a monthly meeting. And by 1650, there were thousands of Quakers in England, meeting most of them in houses in London. They weren't in London yet, but they met in a few bars and whatnot, pubs. But the meeting for worship was just people gathering to worship. So the fundamental structure gradually evolves of the business meeting. So our little worship group, which isn't a Quaker meeting, it's a worship group, is under the care of Charleston Meeting, which is a Quaker monthly meeting for business. And business, of course, is carried out just like worship, in that you don't vote, you don't seek consensus. people examine their consciences collectively and individually and decide about, well, when I was in a meeting outside Philadelphia, the big thing was the new heating system. And the Lord finally told us that we should get, I think it was a carrier heating system, because the guy who would install it for free, and we could use that money to help fix up the graveyard. But the point is that, I mean, I'm being a little bit cynical there maybe, but the point is that decisions are made by the community seeking discernment through comparison of views of what the Lord is telling people in conscience. There's no vote. Individual opinions don't count. It's not my opinion that counts. It's what I think. And as I listen to other people, I realize that, you know, I was really catching this thing in a funny perspective. You know, Fred has got the word. Fred speaks my mind. That's what we say. The friend speaks my mind. But you can come to the sense of the meeting, and the sense of the meeting need not be a consensus at all. There people will say, I'm very uncomfortable with this, but I will stand aside. And sometimes people are asked to stand aside. And occasionally, this happens very seldom. I mean, most decisions are made among friends on the funeral method, but occasionally someone's stance is, well, not ignored, because that person is always, you know, cuddled up to a lot, but simply passed on by. Because the question is, what is the sense of the meeting? And the sense of the meeting may not be right, but it's the closest thing to a decision of truth we can get. But there's a fundamental collectivism in this, communalism, and it's distinctly anti-individual. It's not who holds what opinion, but which opinion ought to be held. And this kind of discernment then works between the meeting and each of its members. We're much less prone to eldering now than we used to be, but there's supposed to be, the meeting has oversight of each person's life, and each person, as part of the meeting, has oversight over the meeting's life and the lives of the other people in it. You join in a loving, Christ-centered, or God-centered, or simply truth-centered, since after all there are a good number of atheist friends, critique of each other, and particularly of each other's behavior. But the fundamental value there, which was enunciated by George Fox at least 80 times, 70 sometimes anyway, that the primary duty of human beings is to know, love, and do the truth. Now, he usually followed that by saying, and the truth is Christ, the gospel and power of God. But truth, on any view that Quakers could deal with, is a truth that's objective to the self. So Quakers evolved this kind of religious structure, putting together, you know, all sorts of Puritan views, separatist views, views of religious radicals of all sorts, but centered around the idea of the active presence of God as an inward light guiding us. Fox and most early friends came from, at least we can say, the lower half of society. Were deeply aware of ways in which the traditional culture, and the goal of the traditional culture was to institute authoritative order through people's habits. They didn't have credit cards, so you didn't have any very good way to manage them. That the traditional hierarchical culture made people at the top much more equal than people at the bottom. And this was institutionalized in all sorts of habits that required the lower folk to kowtow to the higher folk. The most obvious one, and this was still present in a form of it in early America, was verbal. You know, English has the word you, and used to have the words thee and thou. You was a plural pronoun, just like in German where there's sie and du. And so aristocrats had to be addressed by everybody as you. But if the Duke was speaking to one of his servants, he said, will thee, a mere thee, will thee run off and, fetch my chamber pot? Fox, and he wasn't alone in this. I doubt if he started it. It wouldn't surprise me if James Naylor didn't start it. Pushed for a fundamental part of Friends' outward religious life to refuse to recognize that inequality. They're going to thee everybody. And this got a couple of Quakers killed. And certainly got a lot of them in trouble in court when they theed the judge. Now, beyond that, there's this hat business, and who tips their hat to whom, and all this artificial manners. So Quakers refused to tip their hats to anybody. I assume Quaker men took those big broad-brimmed hats off in the house. They certainly didn't sleep in them. But when they were in meeting, the only time they took their hat off was when somebody prayed. They took their hat off to the Lord while somebody prayed. They never tipped their hats to anybody, and it really showed up when Edward Burrough became a Quaker. One of the first things that happens, one of his friends said, you've become a Quaker. Well, how did you know? You refused to tip your hat. William Penn had a similar experience. So, equality. But now what matters here is the equality of humans as fallen creatures open to the Spirit of God. I don't think it occurred to anybody, any Quakers before the 20th century, that there should be, or it didn't occur to very many, that there should be social economic equality, that we should have a classless society. That kind of worldliness really doesn't matter much in the end. What mattered was that everybody had the same standing before God. And you shouldn't put on airs. It was a lack of humility that would make you unable to respond to the light if you expected everybody to bow to you all the time. A similar commitment was to integrity. Now, I think ultimately integrity is the whole goal. I mean, what George Fox wanted was a completely integrated personal experience that went from the inside out, so that he always felt what he should and acted on it. And that's really what he meant by perfection. Perfection was a mature integrity of soul, of the whole of life. But for instance, this eventually stood Quakers in good stead, and in fact sort of led them astray a little bit, because as business people they refused to dicker. You're not going to have any haggling. This is what I think it's worth. I'll sell it to you for X. Or that's what I think it's worth. I'll buy it for such and such. But we're not going to dicker over it. The price is stated, and that's what it is for everybody. so you could send your kid to the store to pick up the Christmas turkey and know that it was going to cost what it said in the window. That helped them in business. Now, perhaps at least today, the most important testimony is probably the peace testimony. And George said, and he was in prison in 1651, and there was going to be a big battle. And they asked him if he wouldn't come out. A lot of the soldiers that wanted to elect him captain, they knew what a great guy he was and what a leader he was. They wanted to elect him captain. And so he could get out of prison if he'd come be captain of this force. And he said, no, not at all. He said, I live in the virtue of that spirit that takes away the cause of all war. And I know what the cause of war is. James said in his letter, the cause of war is the lusts. And so they put him back in jail. And then they asked him out again and said, well, just come and be a soldier. And he refused. They threw him back in for another 6 months. But it wasn't until after the Restoration in the early 1660s, there were a good many little rebellions. The Fifth Monarchy men tried to rebel against Charles II. And many of the dissatisfied elements in the radical community were after Quakers to join in. And 2 or 3, I guess, did. And the Quaker leadership said, this will never do. We want to survive.